called Jimmy Greaves England's greatest goalscorer, but what they didn't tell you is that he became football's biggest drunk, losing an entire decade of his life to the bottle. This is the shocking truth about how a national hero destroyed everything he touched and the lies they told to cover it up. Jimmy Greaves was a footballing genius, one of England's most celebrated sportsmen. He was a peerless goalscorer whose records still stand today. His talent was phenomenal, his success legendary. But behind the fame and glory was a man who would fall so far that he'd wake up in his car, confused about whether it was morning or night, desperately searching dustbins for drops of alcohol from empty bottles. How did a sporting icon become a man who drank 20 pints of beer and a full bottle of vodka every single day? How did he lose his family, his money, and his dignity? And what's the real story behind his so-called redemption? The truth is darker than anyone wants to admit. It all began to unravel when Greaves retired from professional football in 1971 at the ridiculously young age of 31. Instead of gracefully transitioning to life after sport, he chose to walk away from the one thing that gave his life structure and meaning. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice that revealed his inability to cope without the daily adoration of crowds and the rigid schedule of professional athletics. But here's where it gets worse. When he did try to continue playing, he joined West Ham United, a club that already had a notorious drinking culture. Greaves knew exactly what kind of environment he was walking into, yet he chose it anyway. Even before retiring completely, he would go straight from training sessions to a local pub in Romford, staying there until closing time. This wasn't occasional social drinking. This was the beginning of a pattern that would destroy everything in his path. The years between 1972 and 1977 became known as his lost decade, and lost is exactly what he was. Greaves himself admitted he was drunk for 5 straight years, completely blacked out from reality. But this wasn't some mysterious disease that struck without warning. This was the result of his own choices and his refusal to deal with life's challenges like a responsible adult. His daily routine became a nightmare of selfishness and recklessness. Every morning, he would keep a bottle of vodka by his bed so he could start drinking the moment he woke up. This wasn't to enjoy life. It was just to stop his hands from shaking long enough to function. He was using alcohol to avoid withdrawal symptoms, including delirium tremens, which he suffered from regularly. What makes his behaviour even more inexcusable was his complete disregard for public safety. Greaves regularly drove while heavily intoxicated, a fact he later bragged about to journalists. When police stopped him, they would recognise him and let him go instead of arresting him like any ordinary person would be. He was using his celebrity status to escape consequences while putting innocent lives at risk every time he got behind the wheel. The depths of his addiction were truly shocking. He would sometimes wake up in his car on Worley Common, completely disoriented and unable to tell if it was 4 in the morning or 4 in the afternoon. At his absolute lowest point, he admitted to ransacking dustbins to drain the dregs from empty bottles. This wasn't rock bottom caused by circumstances beyond his control. This was the inevitable result of years of selfish choices and refusing to get help. But the real victims of Jimmy Greaves' alcoholism weren't just random strangers on the road or himself. They were his own family. His addiction took a terrible toll on his wife Irene and their 4 children, who watched helplessly as the man they loved disappeared into a bottle. Irene later described trying to communicate with him during this period as being like talking to someone who was under anesthesia all the time. He simply wasn't listening to the people who needed him most. The financial destruction he caused was catastrophic. While players today can earn fortunes, Greaves came from an era when footballers fought for £8 a week. But instead of being responsible with what he had, he drank it all away and more. His addiction led to complete financial collapse and bankruptcy, forcing his family from their home into a modest 1-bedroom flat in Wanstead. The situation became so desperate that Irene was forced to sell her personal jewellery just to try to keep their family home. Think about that for a moment. A woman having to sell her most precious possessions because her husband couldn't stop drinking long enough to provide for his own children. Meanwhile, Greaves was reduced to scratching out a living selling women's jumpers door to door, a pathetic end for someone who had once been a national hero. The ultimate consequence of his selfish behaviour came in 1977, when Irene divorced him. This wasn't a mutual decision or a tragic twist of fate. This was a direct result of his actions and his refusal to prioritise his family over alcohol. Irene later said she didn't divorce Jimmy Greaves the man. She divorced the stranger he had become. But the truth is, he chose to become that stranger through years of putting his addiction before everything else that should have mattered. For years, people tried to make excuses for his behaviour. The most common lie was that his drinking was caused by missing the 1966 World Cup final, a disappointment that supposedly sent him spiralling into alcoholism. Greaves himself rejected this explanation, calling it a small part of his career that he was actually delighted about. But even his denial seems like deflecting blame away from his real problems. The actual trauma that people point to was the death of his infant son, Jimmy Jr., from pneumonia in 1961. This was genuinely devastating for both Jimmy and Irene, and the lack of psychological support in that era meant they were simply told to go home and get on with their lives. It was a terrible tragedy that no parent should endure, but here's the uncomfortable truth. Millions of people faced devastating losses without spending a decade destroying their families with alcohol. The death of his son was a tragedy, but using it as an excuse for a decade of selfish, destructive behaviour that hurt everyone around him is simply not acceptable. Other people find ways to process grief without putting their children at risk and forcing their wives to sell jewellery to survive. When Greaves finally confessed his problems to the world, even that wasn't the brave act of honesty that people claimed it was. In 1978, the Sunday People published his story under the headline, "Drink is Killing Me." But Greaves later admitted he only went public because he knew the story was going to come out anyway. He chose to control the narrative rather than face unexpected exposure. This wasn't courage, it was calculated damage control. He was losing his private war against addiction, so he took the battle public, knowing that the shame and pressure would force him to change. He even admitted he initially hated the publicity and was heartbroken that his problems would be in the public domain. The confession was strategic self-preservation, not heroic honesty. But credit where credit is due, that strategic move actually worked. The public response was overwhelming, with fans and addiction experts offering help and support. More importantly, it finally forced Greaves to face the reality of what he had become and what he needed to do to change. His recovery wasn't immediate or easy. It took multiple attempts at Worley Psychiatric Hospital before he finally succeeded. His wife Irene noted that his first 2 stays were unsuccessful, but the third attempt, which coincided with his public confession, finally worked. On the very day he was supposed to check in for that final stay, he stopped at a nearby pub for one last pint and brandy, declaring it would be his last drink ever. And remarkably, it was. The support he found through Alcoholics Anonymous became crucial to his recovery. He credited the program with helping him rediscover feelings of love, compassion, and companionship that had been buried under years of alcohol abuse. He also returned to football at the non-league level, playing for clubs like Brentwood, Chelmsford, and Barnet, which provided structure and purpose during his recovery. Most importantly, he was able to rebuild his relationship with his family. After making a sincere promise to Irene that he would stay sober, she took him back, and they began the slow process of rebuilding their life together. Although they didn't legally remarry until 2017, Irene always considered them married throughout their separation and reconciliation. Greaves' second career as a media personality proved that redemption was possible. Between 1985 and 1992, he co-hosted the hugely popular ITV show Saint and Greavesy with former Liverpool striker Ian St John. The programme was celebrated for its humour and analysis, and the affable Greavesy became beloved by a whole new generation who knew him as an entertainer rather than a troubled ex-footballer. He also became a powerful, if reluctant, advocate for others struggling with addiction. When his former Tottenham teammate Cliff Jones was battling alcoholism, Greaves visited him personally and confronted him directly, asking if he wanted to lose everything he had. Jones credits this intervention with saving his life, calling it the greatest thing Greaves ever did for him. Jimmy Greaves died at 81, having lived two completely different lives. The first was as a legendary goalscorer whose records still stand today. The second was as a man who fell to the absolute depths of human existence, destroying his family's financial security and emotional well-being through years of selfish choices and addiction. But perhaps that's what makes his story so powerful. Despite making terrible mistakes that hurt the people who loved him most, despite losing everything through his own actions, he managed to reclaim his life and find redemption. His legacy proves that even when someone falls as far as humanly possible, it's still possible to climb back up and rebuild what was broken. That's a lesson worth remembering, even when the fall was largely self-inflicted.